Hi. I'm going to assume that 99% of you have never and will never read the unabridged version of Les Mis. It is 1,500 pages, okay? So it's quite a thick one, but apparently enough fluff can be cut out of it that the abridged version is only 900 pages, so kid stuff, really. So the book's really long, but it somehow survived the test of time, inspiring a musical, and then a movie, and then a movie musical. So why am I reading it, you might wonder? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to my childhood. Picture for a second that you're my parents, okay? You've got a long road trip ahead, you pile your 3 kids into the 2001 Chevy Suburban, and you put in a CD that is sure to entertain them the whole time. The original Broadway cast of Les Miserables. Yeah, that's right. Les Mis was our travel CD when I was a kid. My parents played it for us all the time, which did lead to me skipping around my preschool singing Lovely Ladies. So I've obviously grown up since then, but Les Mis has stayed my favorite musical. And I don't know, I've never read the book. I theoretically read the abridged version in high school, but I didn't really like to be told what to read, and so I didn't really read it. What are they gonna do? Take my high school diploma away? I didn't read it, okay? There, I said it. But I'm gonna read it now. And by going to read it, I mean I've already read the first 300 pages and written like a 20-page script about it. So if you'd like to read along, I'll be very clear in like the intros and the timestamps and title cards and stuff like that about exactly where I am in the book so that you can read along and just go to the portions of the video that you've read up until. But if you would not like to read the book, don't worry. I'll be very clear. I'll be very detailed. You'll know what's happening the whole time. So with that, let's talk about the structure of Les Mis. So it is 1,500 pages, but it is broken up into 5 major parts, each of which is named after one of the major characters. The first section's called Fantine, and then we have Cosette, and then there's Marius, and then Saint-Denis, I believe it's said, and then, of course, Jean Valjean. Each of these sections is then broken down further into what they call books, but they act more functionally like chapters. They are then broken down further into chapters. You've got the sections, and then you've got the books, and then you've got the chapters. Does that make sense? Are you with me? So I've decided to make this first video here about section 1, titled Fantine, and I'll be breaking it up by book. So in today's video, we'll be covering the section Fantine, which is 300 pages exactly, and it gets us to about there in the book. You can also tell I'm subscribed to Jack Edwards because this is how he does his annotations, and it's so smart. You fold down the corner of the page like this, and then you just underline or block out whatever it is you find interesting on the page. It's so much easier than carrying tabs around when you're reading, so not that Jack Edwards needs a shout out from me, but shout out to him because that's a good tip. Me from a bit later cutting in 2 important details that you probably need. This book takes place in France in the 1800s, and it was written by a man named Victor Hugo. And for some reason, I wrote neither of those facts into the intro. There you go. All right, I think that's quite enough preamble. Let's dive in. We open on an introduction to a bishop who lives in a mountain village. Now, if I were not so familiar with the musical or the movie musical, I would have immediately assumed that this guy was the main character, only because of how much time we end up spending with him before anything else happens. That being said, I actually did really enjoy this part, and I'll tell you why. At first, I thought we were just witnessing Victor Hugo's manifesto, right? Because sometimes authors will do this where they'll have a character that kind of represents or drives exactly who they think like the best kind of person would be, or someone who believes very similarly to how they believe in their life, and then it's through conversations with that character that you kind of learn what that author thinks. The thing that's really emphasized here is how good a person the bishop is, right? They talk a lot about how he gives most of the money he's allocated from the Vatican for his own life to the poor of his area. He goes around, he helps everybody, he has no judgment, he's like the picture of forgiveness, and he's the epitome of exactly how you would picture like the best person in the entire world. Yeah, I just thought he was showing us like what his definition of a good person is, so that we then can use that as a baseline to judge all the other characters in the book in comparison to this bishop guy. And at some point in this beginning section, we're introduced to a set of silverware. Okay, the bishop eats with it, and then it's put away in a cabinet above his bed after washing it, presumably. Is that gonna end up being important? Who's to say? But around page 40, we are introduced to the concept that the bishop has a flaw. An ex-senator has moved into the general vicinity that this bishop oversees, right? And when he moves in, he's a little bit shunned by society. He lives in this cabin that's like kind of out of the way, and nobody seems to want to go talk to him, including the bishop. We find out it's because the senator actually voted for the removal of King Louis the 16th. Hey, France. Other names we can use. We don't have to get all the way to 16. Anyway, he did vote to abolish the monarchy, but he did not vote in favor of the execution of King Louis XVI, which is why he is allowed to stay in France now. If you're confused at all by any of this, so was I. Let's take a cut over to French history, Barbie. Hi, I'm French history, Barbie. I'm not sure the hat's working out. I tried really hard to get rid of this line, but I'm not a film girly, so you guys are going to have to forgive me. I might have to forego the hat. There we go. The hat's with us in spirit. I'm wearing the hat in all of our minds. If anybody knows film and wants to comment how I set up my lights to not have that, because I have a feeling we're going to need French history Barbie in the next installments. I just realized you can see a water bottle, so I'm going to move that. Now I'm French history Barbie and sustainability Barbie. But this book was published in 1869 in France, so it was pretty safe for the author to assume that anybody reading it was at least quasi-aware of the plot and timeline of the French Revolution, but I, a 25-year-old American, am not as aware. So they tell you pretty early in that this part takes place during 1815, but this means nothing to me. This is just a year that happened a long time ago. Like, I don't know what that means in the context of the French Revolution. So if you're familiar with the movie or the musical or the movie musical, then you might have clocked something weird in there when I was describing the plot, because I sure clocked it. I clocked it when I was reading, okay? And that's that they talk about the French Revolution in the past tense. Now, my understanding of Les Mis is that it takes place before the French Revolution, right? I didn't think it took place during. I thought it took place before. So now I'm confused. What's going on with the French Revolution? It turns out there are two French Revolutions. One of them, the first and the more popular, the more widely known French Revolution, was in 1790, and that was when they were revolting against King Louis XVI. The other one isn't until 1848. So this book starts in 1815 and ends in 1832 with the battles of the June Rebellion, which is a sight that Victor Hugo actually witnessed himself, which I think is pretty cool. In all of my research for this, I was reading a Wikipedia article that was about the June Rebellion, and in an article about the June Rebellion, they talk about Les Mis, the book, because it's a famous depiction of it, and they say, many who have not read the book often wrongly assume it takes place either during the more widely known French Revolution of the 1790s or the French Revolution of 1848. It's me, okay? I'm many. To be fair to myself, I didn't think it happened during the French Revolution. I thought it happened before the French Revolution, but I did fully think it happened before the first French Revolution, and I was blissfully unaware of the second one. Back to you. So this senator moves into a kind of remote house in the general vicinity that the bishop oversees, and he's shunned a little bit by society, including by the bishop. Now, the bishop is a little bit of a devout nationalist, and so he does not want to go visit the senator. He doesn't want to talk to him. He kind of agrees with society that this man is an undesirable, which is very, very unique for the bishop, right? He's generally very forgiving, generally very accepting of everyone, except this one guy. But then he finds out that the guy is on his deathbed, and his conscience gets to him, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to go read this guy his last rites, even if I don't agree with him. Is that how you say that? Or am I thinking of Miranda rights? Perform his last rites. However, when the bishop gets there, the senator is actually pretty opposed to him performing the last rites, and kind of makes the point that he doesn't see himself to be a sinner, and he doesn't see himself somebody who needs absolution. And they end up in a very fascinating debate that I think is actually kind of the entire point of this section, and why we ended up spending so much time with the bishop. What they are debating here is the ethical merit of revolution. Right? And, you know, these actions that are generally considered to be bad actions by most societies of the world, like murder and theft and all these things, that when you commit them in the name of a revolution, in the name of freeing an oppressed population from their oppressors, do you still consider those to be unethical actions? Kind of that Machiavellian idea of, do the ends justify the means? Hi, I'm wearing a different outfit. I'm learning a ton through making this video, but the footage for this section just didn't turn out exactly how I want, so we're redoing it. So we just wrapped up this conversation between the bishop and the senator where they were talking about the ethical merits of revolution. You might be asking yourself a very important question at this point. Why? I've already spoiled a little bit that the bishop is not the main character. If you're not familiar with Les Mis, this guy is about to have an interaction with the main character and then basically disappear for the rest of the show. So why? Why did we spend so much time with him? Why did we see this conversation between him and the senator? And how do these sections end? Well, the answer is it's the theme. It's the theme of the whole book. Did we need to spend 60 pages with him in order to understand what that theme is? Probably not, but I still thought it was like some pretty beautiful writing, and I did enjoy reading it a lot, so I can forgive. Psst. If you're doing a book report and you have me playing in the background of something else that you're doing, pause whatever it is and pay attention. Fundamentally, Les Mis is a story about redemption. Kind of. We think of stories about redemption as kind of these pull yourself up by your bootstraps stories where this person maybe isn't in the best situation, but they get themselves out of it and that's how they end up redeeming themselves. This is not how Les Mis does it. Okay, Victor Hugo redeems his characters by deep diving into each of their lives and showing how any one of us could be just like them if put in the wrong situation. The point of this whole entire book is that society creates its own enemies. People born or put into desperate situations take desperate action in order to survive and then are punished for that, essentially. Now, the populations that he kind of refers to when he talks about this, at least up to this point in the book, the point that I've read, are criminals, sex workers, and revolutionists, so people who want to rebel against the government. I want to stress, before we really dive into talking about the theme here, that neither Victor Hugo nor I believe these people to be undesirable, but it's kind of important to this discussion to understand that society views these people as undesirable. So I will kind of refer to them from here on out as society's undesirables because I think that's the best way to word it, but just know that that's not my own opinion on these individuals. Okay, with all that preamble in place, let's dive into the actual theme in the conversation. In the conversation between the bishop and the senator, they're mostly focused on the revolutionists, right? So the people who rebel against the government. King Louis XVI was executed in 1793, and his son died in prison at the age of 10 in 1795. The bishop represents the perspective that an unethical action is unethical no matter what the context is. So that, like, a murder is a murder, no matter what. The senator represents the perspective that if that murder is done not just with the purpose of killing that individual, but with the purpose of freeing an oppressed population, that it is fundamentally ethical. I'm using the word unethical because I think it makes it a little bit more broad as a message, but in the book they are talking about it more from like a sin perspective. And when they kind of dive into this debate about what some of the revolutionists did in order to overthrow the government, the bishop kind of keeps returning back to this point of the fact that people were killed and specifically children were killed. He keeps kind of returning back to what about all these horrible things that were done to these people? How can you justify those things? And the senator pretty simply is like, well, what about all the horrible things that those people were doing to the people of France? And he goes on to say that those actions weren't in vain, essentially. The point of it was not to kill the king. The point of it was to free the people of France. And the senator ends up changing the bishop's mind. He actually ends up successfully convincing him that the ends do justify the means. And the bishop ends up asking for the senator's forgiveness just before the senator dies. This whole exchange with the senator really strikes a chord with the bishop, and as we see him continuing to do his bishop duties, there's a little bit more contemplation added. This book, which again is the first book of 8 in the Fantine section, ends with 2 chapters, one called What He Believed and the other called What He Thought. Now, I have to be annoying for a second here and put another asterisk on what I'm about to say because I know that this subject is very, very sensitive, especially on the internet. We're going to talk about religion a little bit here, and I just want to reiterate that the purpose of this video is for me to read and interpret the text. So I'm going to be talking about what my interpretation of what Victor Hugo is trying to say with these chapters is. This is not my opinion, okay? I'm probably still going to get comments about it anyway, but I just want to stress that this is not my opinion on religion. This is just my interpretation of what Victor Hugo is trying to tell us with these 2 chapters here. In What He Believed, Victor Hugo stresses that we don't actually know the truth of what the bishop believed regarding religion. So again, if you're writing a book report, you can say that the narrator is not omniscient, right? He can't read the characters' minds. He only knows what he's told by them or what he observes. I think this is such an interesting thing to include, to just say, yeah, we don't know if he believed. We just know that those beliefs never led to hypocrisy. That's basically what Victor Hugo says here. This bishop very firmly represents that whole idea of forgiveness and acceptance and love, and he lives this very frugal life and like all these things that imply that he's a very firm believer, and yet Victor Hugo puts the asterisk on it and says, we don't know. We don't know that he actually believed. We just know that it seemed like he did. The following chapter adds an extra layer to this that just makes it so interesting. I'm like very happy I'm reading this. So, in the chapter called What He Thought, Victor Hugo then goes on to talk about how the bishop seems like a relatively simple man. Now, he doesn't mean simple as an insult. He just means that the bishop seems, on the surface, again, we don't know for sure, but he seems content to just trust the Gospels and believe and not really ever question what he's been taught. He specifically talks about how philosophers who question God have this existential dread that comes with it, saying, this is direct religion filled with anxiety and responsibility for those who would scale its walls. And later in this chapter talks about people who present their own religion directly to God. So when you start to really question the messages of the church and what you've been taught, that it kind of leads to this feeling of dread and anxiety, and that it's almost you like creating your own religion. Don't worry, I'm getting to a point here, but I need to stress one more thing. Up until this point in the book, I haven't really touched on it because it hasn't been relevant. Victor Hugo has thrown in these tiny criticisms of the Catholic Church as an institution. So he talks about how the bishop is pretty unique and that he lives such a frugal life, and how a lot of the bishops within the Catholic Church live these very lavish lifestyles with the money they're given by the Vatican. The bishop also at one point goes to the Vatican and leaves super early, and when asked by the people of his diocese why he left so early, he says that he didn't get along with the other bishops and basically that they kicked him out of the meeting. So we've been watching this man walk around, we've been watching him be this just fundamentally super holy man, and then we find out that from Victor Hugo's perspective, basically none of the other bishops are like that. He also has talked a lot about people who are very hypocritical in their righteousness, right? Like they see themselves to be very good people, and so they use that as a reason to be judgmental of others, which just doesn't make any sense, right? So if we combine all of it together, everything I've kind of teased out, right? The theme, maybe what Victor Hugo's own interpretation of everything is, these tiny criticisms that he's included of the Catholic Church, where do we end up? This is my best psychoanalysis that I can do of Victor Hugo. I think he believes in God, but does not believe in the institution of the Catholic Church, at a time in which that would not have been widely accepted. I think he lived at a time in which questioning the church was not really super welcome. This is at a time where there was a ton of religious turmoil in England, and you almost had these two warring factions of the Catholic Church and the Church of England, right? And the Church of England had only existed for 200 years. I think the best works of fiction come from when the author themselves has a question that they are trying to answer for themselves. And I think this was Victor Hugo trying to reconcile his own feelings about the church and religion on top of French society as a whole. I don't just think, I know that he agrees with the senator. I know that he believes that the ends do justify the means, and that the context of a situation dictates whether or not an action could be considered a sin, or whether or not an individual has some kind of personal moral failing. And he's essentially trying to reconcile that with himself and show his own point and his own perspective, and in his own words, create his own religion for himself. All right, now back to me from the other day to finish up. We open on an introduction to none other than Jean Valjean. Finally, we're on page 59, by the way. He's the main character if you're not familiar with the story. He arrives to the same village that the bishop lives in, and he's hungry, and he needs an inn, and he's just ready for a big meal and a good night's sleep. Only problem, he appears to be infamous. Everywhere he goes, everybody hates him. They don't want to let him stay. They don't want to let him eat. They don't want to let him sleep there. Everybody's just kind of turning him out on the street and being like, you have to go, you have to go, you have to go. Finally, he arrives at this like random house where we find out that it's because he's an ex-con and that he had to declare himself at the city hall when he first got there, and that on his paperwork it says that he's like a very dangerous man. So after everyone in the village turns him away, he ends up just kind of laying on a bench for the night, trying to get some rest, when somebody goes up to him and recommends that he goes to the bishop's house. Then we cut to a perspective inside the bishop's house, where one of the women who kind of works with the bishop is explaining to him that they should get a bolt for the door because there's this dangerous man in the area, and nobody knows who he is, just that he's an ex-con, and he's so dangerous, and we have to be able to lock the door, but the priest is like so adamant that we never lock the door, and she's like, we need to get a bolt. And as she's going on this rant, Valjean just comes bursting through the front door. This scene was stupid funny to me when I was reading it. Tell me that you couldn't picture this happening in an Adam Sandler film. Look me in my face and tell me that. Imagine a suburban home, okay? Adam Sandler's sitting on the house. On the house? He's not on the house, you guys. Adam Sandler is sitting on the couch, and his wife, who's presumably like Jennifer Aniston or something, comes in and starts telling him about the weird new neighbor and how everybody's suspicious of the neighbor and we gotta keep an eye out for the neighbor. But Adam Sandler is distracted. Some hijinks is going on and it's like building and building and the noise is getting louder and louder and his wife is like yelling at him like, are you listening to me? And then the door just bursts open and Jean Valjean walks in. Now in that movie, I think he would turn out to be Santa in the end or something, but I gotta tell you, I do not think that's how this book is gonna end. But it just, I don't know why, like when I was reading it, that was like all I could like picture in my mind was like this scene anyway. So Valjean comes bursting through the door and he's hungry and he needs a place to sleep. And the bishop, who's played by Adam Sandler apparently, totally lets him in and lets him have dinner with them and gives him a place to sleep for the night. Now, among their conversation at dinner, we get a bit of a time skip back, where it's explained that Valjean spent 19 years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread, and also trying to escape like 4 times. He stole the loaf of bread to feed his sister and her 7 kids while they were all starving, and tried to escape at numerous points, and so that's how he ends up in prison for such a long period of time. Now, the prison system in France was horrific at the time, with people obviously being really over-sentenced for their crimes, put in horrific living conditions, forced into almost like a labor camp of a prison where they have to work for what would be a criminally low wage in any other job. They're also put in solitary at a moment's notice. They're chained up all the time, and they're kind of beaten, whipped by the prison guards. Thank God that's not how our prison system works, am I right, ladies? This book made me very existential. So Victor Hugo clearly had strong opinions about the prison system in France, even going so far as to include a sea metaphor talking about how people fall overboard and are just left behind by society. Remember our theme, right? Remember our theme. When speaking about Valjean, he says, "What has happened within this soul? Let us try to give an answer. Society absolutely must look into these things since they are its own work." I just think that's really beautiful and unfortunately still true. He's in prison, he tries to escape a few times, he ends up there 19 years, and then he's released on parole, where he's given 109 francs and 15 sous, an amount that means literally nothing to me, especially in the year 1815. Hi, I'm wearing a blazer. I attempted to adjust for inflation and then translate into dollars. A random guy on Quora says that 1 franc in 1815 would be about £4.20 today, which is like $5.30, give or take, meaning that he left prison with $577.70 in francs, and from what I can tell, a sou is 1/20th of a franc, which brings his total up to $581.75. Now, I then found a historical currency calculator that backed this up, putting the amount at about $673 in absolute worth. So it's close enough for the idea, right? Okay, I was close enough. However, interestingly enough, the website also said that in man hours, that was about 765 hours of work on average, which, again, on average, someone would be paid around $19,000 for in the present day. So I'm not sure if the cost of goods has gone up outside of inflation, or if that really just goes to show how horrible the economic situation was in France at the time, but I just thought that was interesting. Back to you. So he leaves prison with a hardened heart and $673, give or take. He's required to show his papers literally everywhere he goes, declaring him to be a convict, and he's pretty much shunned by society as a result. All right, jumping back to the perspective inside of the bishop's house. So we get this time skip, we come back. They have a really good meal, and then the bishop shows Valjean to his room. And while they're going to his room, we see where the bishop keeps the silverware. Okay? I told you that stuff was going to be important. Valjean wakes up in the middle of the night and decides to steal the silverware. When he goes into the bishop's room, the light kind of mysteriously illuminates the bishop's face while he's sleeping, and it causes him to kind of stand there for a while and stare at him and really think about like what he's doing and whether or not he wants to go through with this. I mention this only because it made me laugh so hard when I was reading it. Like, mentally picture it, okay? The bishop's laying in his bed, he's asleep. The light illuminates his face out of nowhere, and then Valjean just stands there like this. I hope that looked okay, because that's the shot that I have. So he thinks about it, but he decides to go through the theft anyway to give himself a better life. And then he's caught by police sometime the next day and brought back before the bishop, where arguably one of the most famous scenes in the entire book happens. The bishop lies and says that he gifted Valjean the silverware, and even goes so far as to also give him some candlesticks, saying, I gave you these as well and you left them behind, why would you do that? And he's convincing enough that the police totally believe him, and they leave Valjean alone. Valjean is floored by this. He doesn't understand not only why the bishop would have lied to the police for him, but also why the bishop does actually seem dead set on giving him this silverware. Like, he does gift the stuff to Valjean after the police leave. And the bishop explains, saying, do not forget, ever, that you have promised me to use the silver to become an honest man, and later adding, it is your soul that I am buying for you. I touch on these two lines specifically because they were somewhat pulled for the musical. It's not exact, but in the musical there's a song called The Bishop that depicts this scene where the bishop says, you must use this precious silver to become an honest man, which is almost verbatim what he says in the book. And then that song ends with him saying, I have bought your soul for God. I have always thought that was one of the coolest lines in the whole entire show, because who would think to word it like that? Like, I have bought your soul for God.
Okay, so I'd actually like to call out the movie musical because they changed this line for some reason. I don't know why, because like I said, it's like one of the coolest lines in the whole show, but they changed it to I have saved your soul for God instead of I have bought your soul for God. I was gonna go get a screenshot of the lyrics for this section so you could just compare them directly on screen to the lyrics from the book, you know, make you some good content, and I can't find a depiction of the original lyrics anywhere. Every set of lyrics that I find is like based off of the movie musical version for some reason, even though the musical has existed since the 80s. So then I'm like, did I just Mandela affect myself? Like, is that actually the line? Or maybe because I mostly listen to the 10th anniversary Dreamcast, that's why I think that's the line. No, I looked it up in the original Broadway cast and I was right. The line is, I have bought your soul for God. I don't know why they changed it. It pissed me off when the movie came out, and it just re-pissed me off now because now I can't put it on the screen. So sorry about that.
Here's where a really interesting distinction happens between the musical and the book. Because in the musical, the bishop does this, and then Valjean pretty much immediately has his whole soliloquy where he's like, what have I done? And he decides to turn his life around. In the book, he just kind of walks away, and he's like, man, that was weird. And then it's kind of like bothering him, and he's thinking about it, and he's like, I really don't know what to make of any of that. And then he's on the highway, and he's just kind of like sitting there chilling, thinking about life, and this kid walks by. And it's implied in the way that this kid is described that he probably doesn't have a lot of money, and he's flipping this money around. He has like a few coins and he's flipping it around in his hands, and he drops some of it in front of Valjean, and Valjean puts his foot on the coin and won't give it back to the kid, and the kid ends up running away crying. A few hours go by and Valjean finally stands up to continue on his way, and he looks down under his foot and he sees the money, and it really occurs to him, like it sinks in, that he stole that money from a poor child. He ends up just sprinting around the countryside trying to find this kid and give him his money back and presumably a little bit more, but he can't find him literally anywhere and ends up riddled with guilt and just asking himself, why did I do that? Why did I do that? Why did I do that? I like this extra detail, obviously. I'm harping on it, right? But the reason I like it is because up to this point, without this detail included, all of Valjean's crimes are relatively understandable. You can easily understand how somebody would steal food to feed their family when they're starving, or how they would steal something valuable that they could sell to give themselves a better life if they feel really desperate and like they're not going to be able to survive without it. Why would he steal from the kid? He doesn't need money, he just got the silver from the bishop. So why did he do it? Now, he comes to the conclusion that the reason is because he's bitter and angry at the world. And I love this section for that exact reason. Throughout the book and up to this point, and in the musical too, we are told on many occasions that Valjean is a bitter and angry man, but we don't really ever see him act on it, right? Like, we're mostly watching a man act out of desperation, and you really feel for him through a lot of what's happened up to this point. But I'll admit that when I was watching this interaction go down with this kid, I hated Valjean for a second. I was like, bro, what are you doing? Like, you don't need that money. Why are you making that kid cry? Why are you making his life so hard? Like, just give him his money back. Like, what's wrong with you? I just think it makes it significantly more impactful, right? And it kind of puts more context into why in the show they always say that Valjean was this like horrible criminal, because I'm like, I don't know, he just doesn't really seem that bad, does he? This is the moment Valjean decides to turn his life around, and also the end of book 2. But I do have some quick thoughts before we move on. I am increasingly both impressed and scared by how applicable a lot of what I'm reading is to the modern day. I don't know if you caught a few of those jokes I was making. There is something so incredibly existential about reading a book that was written 150 something years ago and finding elements of your own society inside of it. This book is starting to remind me a lot of 1984 and Parable of the Sower, which came out in 1949 and 1993, respectively. Both of those books feel very timeless, right? You read them in the modern day and you think, damn, like everything they're talking about is applicable to what is happening in our society now. And before you get on my case, 1993 was 30 years ago, whether you like it or not. Les Mis is starting to have this same feel to me, but significantly more impressive because it's 154 years old. Just put that into perspective. I can't help but draw a direct correlation to the prison system in America today. I mean, the harsh sentences, the poor living conditions, the paying illegally low wages for labor, and justifying all of it just because they're criminals, and the way society then turns their back on people that are criminals and really shuns them. All of this is possible through that othering of the convicts. They're not people, they're criminals, and so they are not deserving of the same unalienable rights that all other human beings supposedly have. I just feel like I'm getting a lot more out of it than just reading a good story. Now on to book 3. We open on a whole chapter about 1817 and a bunch of events that happened in the year 1817. He begins by describing it as the year that Louis the 18th, so they didn't listen to me on the whole name thing. Anyway, it's the year Louis the 18th, called the 22nd year of his reign. I'm back. Did you miss me? French History Barbie has returned to save the day. So I went to see how many King Louis there were total, just because I thought it would be a funny bit, and the internet said 18, so we were on the last King Louis, right? But then out of curiosity, I decided to look up who the last king of France was, and it said King Louis the 16th. So how does that make any sense? So supposedly, allegedly, King Louis XVI is the last king of France, but King Louis XVIII existed and was alive at some point during the 1800s. And what happened to King Louis XVII? Where did he go? So King Louis XVII is actually the second son of King Louis XVI, a fact I point out only so that we understand that both of his sons were named Louis, just to be safe. So the internet has him listed as being in power for about 2 years after the death of King Louis XVI, who was his father, but he was in prison for both of those years and died at the age of 10, which is really sad. So I'm not really sure why they have him listed as a king, but he's King Louis XVII, apparently. I might be looking down at my notes a little bit here because I want to make sure I get this exactly correct because it's about to get confusing. So Napoleon was the one who took over when the monarchy fell in the 1790s, right? 1793, King Louis XVI gets his head cut off. Now Napoleon's in charge.
This is unfortunately incorrect. Turns out there's like a whole First Republic in between 1792 and 1804. But this is what it looked like. So I think we can all agree. I don't need to individually cover each of these people. We can all be in agreement on that, correct? Okay, so Napoleon took over in 1804, and we're just going to start there.
He fell from power in 1814, and King Louis XVIII took over then. Now, he is the brother of King Louis XVI. Okay, so King Louis XVII's uncle. Are you with me? Like, at this point, you're getting the impression that genuinely every man in this family lineage was named Louis and probably called something else just so that in case they became king, they were King Louis. Why Louis? Why that name? So Louis I is also known as Louis the Pious. He apparently also had the nickname the Fair and Debonair, a nickname I was theoretically able to corroborate on other websites, but they all worded it so similarly, if not exactly, to the original website I found it on, with the same footnote, formatted in the same font that led to the same exact footnote. That was just a bunch of translations of the words fair and debonair into different languages, that I can't help but think that this was just a 10-year-old who edited the Wikipedia page at one point and somehow altered French history. So, Louis I, Louis the Pious, allegedly Louis the Fair and Debonair, he was king of the Franks and co-emperor of this whole area with Charlemagne in 813. Now, this whole lineage is really hard to track, apparently, because when the kings died, they, split their land amongst their sons. It wasn't like they had one son that they passed it down to. So there aren't a bunch of Louis right in a row, and it's kind of hard to know who was related to who. They don't start consistently being only King Louis until Louis VIII. Louis VIII took over in 1613, and from there until 1834, all French kings were named Louis. So then Napoleon was in power until 1814, when his whole business fell apart and King Louis XVIII took back over. But he only took over for 10 months, and then Napoleon took back over France. However, Napoleon was only back in charge for about 94 days, and then his son takes over for 15 days. His son is also named Napoleon. And then Louis XVIII took back over for about 5 years before he died and left the monarchy to his brother, Charles. Charles was in charge for 5 years before 2 other guys were king for 20 minutes and then 7 days, allegedly? And that's when the monarchy ends.
You know, I just realized I never explained why they call King Louis XVI the last king of France. It's because that's when they actually voted to legally abolish the monarchy. So according to the French Constitution, there wasn't a monarchy, but obviously there was a lot of turmoil, so that wasn't exactly true. Anyway.
So now that we're all on the same page about the tumultuous French politics that were happening all the time, I'll pass it back to you. So again, the whole first chapter of this book is about all these events that happened in the year 1817. And it may seem kind of pointless, but Hugo himself explains why he included this chapter before we move on, so I'll just read that to you. Such was the confused mass of the now forgotten events that floated like flotsam on the surface of the year 1817. History ignores almost all these minutiae. It cannot do otherwise. It is under the dominion of infinity. Nonetheless, these details, which are incorrectly termed little, there being neither little facts in humanity nor little leaves in vegetation, are useful. It is the features of the years that makes up the face of the century. Then, we meet Fantine on page 120 of a section called Fantine. She's very beautiful. And she's in this foursome of friends, and then there's this foursome of guys, and they make 4 little couples. Her man, whose name is pronounced
Félix Tholomyès.
I'm just going to call him Tholo, okay? I'm not French. Turns out he's ugly. I didn't know that. You never actually see him in the musical. You only know what he ends up doing to Fantine, which would make him ugly no matter what. But because of what ends up happening, I always imagine him to be this charming, attractive, beautiful man. Turns out he's just as ugly on the outside as he is on the inside. And the fact that that's distinctly written in the book tells me that Victor Hugo is for the girls. We get some really beautiful chapters in here about young love and being young in Paris and other things that French people care a lot about. I don't think this part is worth going over every little detail. Basically, we just see these couples. Eventually, they all go on this trip together, and the girls keep harassing the guys to have some kind of surprise. They want a surprise from them, right? And the guys are like, it's time for your surprise. It's time to surprise you. And then they leave them. And they just leave a note behind, basically being like, well, we were always bred to be these family men in the country, so we're returning to the country to be the men we need to be for our families. And of course, you ladies, who are all poor, could not possibly serve as suitable wives for us. That's essentially what the letter says. Most of the girls don't really care too much about this, but Fantine is pregnant. So this is obviously a big deal for her because now she has to figure out how to provide for this child. we get a time skip. And here's where there's a little bit of an inconsistency, actually. I found a little bit of an error in this book, and I'm so convinced that I read it wrong that I went back like 4 or 5 different times to like make sure I didn't miss anything. And I'm pretty sure that there's a timeline error in here. This part, you'll remember, starts in 1817. There's a whole chapter about it. You could not be confused about that, okay? This takes place in 1817. Then Hugo specifically states at the end of this section that 10 months have passed, okay? And Fantine now looks much more hardened by life. And she's got the kid with her. She's walking down the road. She passes a mother with 2 children at the inn. And that mother says to her, "How old is your child?" And she says, "Almost 3 years old." Now, here's where I was convinced I just missed some line that said that more time had passed. Could not find it. Could not find it. And in fact, later in the section, after she says the kid is 3, it specifically mentions that the year is 1818. Okay? There is no way that she's pregnant in 1817 and the kid's 3 in 1818. That doesn't make any sense. I don't know. I don't have a resolution for you. I swear to God I read this section 5 times. I could not figure out how the kid was gestated, born, and reached the age of 3 in the span of 10 months. There's no more time skip. We don't really have a choice but to go with it, though. So the kid's 3. Moving on. We find out that Fantine has tried to contact Tholo many times to no avail, and that he's completely ignoring her again. Ugly, ugly man. And that's kind of the last mention we get of him. He's mentioned a little bit later in the chapter, but only for Victor Hugo to kind of keep making digs about how crappy a guy he is. Fantine's on her way out into the country to find work, but she's a little bit concerned about arriving at more of a mountain village with a child out of wedlock and that the people won't be super accepting. And so she decides to leave her kid at this inn where this mother has these 2 daughters and pay them to take care of her child for a few years while she saves up money. That's right, the random inn woman I mentioned. She's Madame Thénardier. In the book, they have 2 kids. In the show, they only have 1, Eponine being the older one and the one that ends up becoming important to the plot. And they have a younger daughter named Azelma. I have no idea if she'll end up becoming important in the book, but I do know that in the musical, she doesn't ever really come into play. She doesn't even exist, truthfully. And Fantine's daughter's name is Cosette. I don't think I said that. So Fantine leaves Cosette at the inn with the Thénardiers and goes out and finds work in the country. But we find out after Fantine leaves that the Thénardiers really actually aren't that good of people. And they take really good care of their own daughters, but now that they have Cosette in the house, they kind of abuse her and make their own daughters very special and are very, very mean to Cosette. We also find out that they're kind of bleeding Fantine dry. They're asking her for a bunch of money for all these like doctor's appointments and stuff, but they don't really need it. They're just kind of using Cosette as a cash cow and an excuse to get this money out of Fantine because Fantine really has no way to double check whether or not the kid's actually sick. Fantine's really good about sending the money for a few years, but then it starts to kind of taper out near the end of Cosette's stay with the Thénardiers, and that's the end of book 4. We jump to a little industrial town where a mysterious man appeared a few years ago. They call him Father Madeleine. He reinvents the way they make something, I don't really think it matters, and has earned himself a fortune of 673,000 francs. Going back to our historical calculator, this looks to be about $3,544,851 US dollars today. So he is in fact rich. And presumably would be more so if he hadn't given so much money to the people of the village. Back to you. At some point, we get a snapshot of the inside of this guy's room, where there are 2 silver candlesticks sitting on the mantle. And lastly, the Bishop of Digny. I don't know, French is so weird with their pronunciations, okay? That's the bishop from the beginning of the book. But that's his actual title. That's his name. Anyway, we find out that the bishop died, and Father Madeleine ends up kind of publicly mourning him, right? Like wearing all the black and stuff like that, and everybody in the area is like, "Did you know him, Father Madeleine?" And he's like, "I did, a long time ago." He's also at some point kind of forcibly elected mayor. Like he just gets nominated, and he's like, "I don't really want to be mayor," and all the people are like, "Become the mayor." And he's like, "Okay." And now he's the mayor. He also mysteriously calls around for young chimney sweeps and gives them money out of nowhere and asks them what their name is. It's Valjean! The guy is Valjean. I don't know why I was so aggressive about that. It's Valjean. Okay? This guy is Valjean. Alright, I got this fat water cup. I don't know why I was trying to film this whole video without water. And on page 169, we meet him. Javert. He's our other main character. Just so you know. Now, this is one little detail that is a little different in the musical. You meet him in the opening song because he's one of the prison guards. I assume they just did this so that you actually meet both main characters right at the beginning. Though comparatively, we are still kind of in the beginning of this book. If this book was only 300 pages, we're on page 34. Javert is a police officer, and as he's being described, a fair bit of emphasis is put on his sideburns. The sideburns are canon! I had not even realized until I read this description of Javert that the sideburns were like a thing, but then once I read that, I pictured Philip Quast from the 10th Anniversary Dreamcast, and I was like, oh yeah, he does have those like sideburns they put on his face. And then literally every single mental image I could conjure up of someone who's played Valjean, they have the sideburns. Turns out that's like direct from the source material. That might seem like a small little detail to you, but I put the book down and reflected on that for at least 5 minutes. We're also introduced here to Javert's mindset, okay? And this is going to end up becoming really, really important. This is arguably the most important piece of his character, and that's that he believes the world to be very black and white. And once you're a sinner, in a sense, or like someone who's committed a bad act of some kind, you will always be a bad person. He does not believe in redemption. There's no such thing as redemption. He just doesn't think it's a thing. There's actually a fourth wall break in here somewhere where Victor Hugo literally describes him as a symbol. Like he's saying to you, use this character as a representation for people who have this mindset about life. Now we're at the runaway cart scene, if you're familiar, where a cart falls on a man in the street and it's really heavy and it kind of has to be lifted like perfectly straight up and down, or the stuff that's on the cart will fall on the guy. And Valjean is there and he's walking around to the different people of the city and being like, who wants to get underneath the cart and lift it from underneath so that you can keep it kind of even and so this guy can slide right out. The mental logistics of this don't really work, but it's important that only one person can lift the cart, so we're just gonna go with it. Javert says to him, Monsieur le Maire, I have only known one man who can do what you are asking. Again, if you're familiar, that's a line that ends up being directly pulled. I have only known one other who can do what you have done. It's afterwards, but same basic idea. Javert mentions he's a convict, right? He used to know this convict way back in the prison at Toulon that had this like just superhuman strength, and he'd never seen anything like it, and he was the only man he'd ever known who was capable of what Valjean was suggesting. This is a direct threat. Valjean at this point is very suspicious of the mayor, and he doesn't really like know why, but this whole situation kind of clicks it into place for Javert, like what it is about the mayor that bothers him. He reminds him of this convict he used to know. Valjean fully picks up on what Javert is accusing, right? But he ends up deciding to save the man's life anyway, and he lifts the cart off of him. And this is where we kind of find out that Valjean has this superhuman strength. It seems like a small thing, like it's just what Javert uses to recognize him, but it actually will end up becoming somewhat important to the plot. Valjean has just this immense, almost unexplainable strength. He's an incredibly strong man. Valjean, he's super strong. He lifts the cart off the guy, and Javert's like, that was weird. Now, we're jumping around a little bit here, okay? But it's not my fault. This is how the book is written, okay? So bear with me. We're jumping back to Fantine. So Fantine gets to this mountain village, and she's working in the factory. And at some point, they find out that she has an illegitimate child, and they're super not okay with it. She kind of accurately predicted that. And she ends up getting ousted from her job. Now, there's a few important things to note here. One, there's a really fun passage here where Victor Hugo is making fun of people who, like, gossip and ruin people's lives for no reason. And so he specifically goes to mention that it genuinely affects nobody else in the factory that this is true, and yet some gossip, like, wanted to see where she was sending letters and, like, went and figured it out and, like, tattled on her to everyone, and then she ends up getting ousted for no reason. And when they were ousting her from the factory, they put in that it was actually the mayor himself who wanted her kicked out. even though that's not really true. Also, the sun is really disappearing now. I just look so illuminated. Sorry about that. So Fantine gets fired from her job, and the Thénardiers start asking her for even more money. They're basically bleeding her dry. And she starts to do whatever she can to make money. She's sewing shirts for the local prison, but then they cut the amount they pay per shirt, and she still can't make ends meet, so she ends up selling her hair, which is included in the musical, and then her 2 front teeth, which is not included in the musical and also is horrifying. After all of that, she ends up becoming a sex worker in order to make ends meet. And all of this is for money that she sends for her daughter, but the Thénardiers don't really need the money for her daughter. They're just bleeding her dry, essentially. I want to add here that I have now mentioned sex work a few different times. There's this really big push in the modern day to not view sex work as such an undesirable thing, but there's 2 important things to note here. The first is that, again, this book takes place in the 1800s, and also that Fantine did not choose to be a sex worker because she wanted to be. She was forced into sex work in order to provide for herself and her daughter, and so that's why it's sad.
I just realized I never clarified that I mentioned there's this push to view sex work as an empowering thing. I very much agree with that push, and the reason why Fantine's story is sad is because she did not choose sex work for herself.
I was surprised by how hard I found this section to read, mostly just because I know what happens to Fantine. Like, I know her story, I'm familiar with it. I was not surprised by anything that I read, and yet reading it in book form, it hits so much harder than the songs do. I'm sorry, it does. It felt so much like when you watch a movie and you know what's going to happen, but you don't want it to happen, and you're just like, no, do something different, do something different. Like, I'm reading it the whole time just hoping that for some reason something different happens, and it ends up a happier ending for her. But the book is called The Miserables, so I don't know why I was hoping for that, honestly. And again, Victor Hugo ends up kind of breaking the 4th wall in order to directly tell the reader what he wants you to learn from this. And I don't know, I'm really enjoying these kind of little cutouts, and I think it's a fun extra tidbit that I didn't know was in there. Anyway, this is page 187, if you'd like to read along. What is this story of Fantine about? It is about society buying a slave. From whom? From misery. From hunger, from cold, from loneliness, from desertion, from privation. Melancholy barter. A soul for a piece of bread. Misery makes the offer, and society accepts. The theme, anyone? The theme. I give you the theme of the book. So Fantine's out and about, and this man comes up to her and starts kind of harassing her, and she's ignoring him, and then she dumps a bunch of snow, or he dumps a bunch of snow on her, and then she kind of attacks him, right? Rightfully so, I think. Javert witnesses this and arrests her immediately, but when they're at the jail and he's like kind of trying to process her, they run into Valjean, who really ends up feeling for her and starts to try and like help her and ask her more about her story. And she's basically like, fuck you, dude, this is your fault. You were the one who made it so that I lost my job. You were the one who didn't want me in the factory because I had an illegitimate child. And what's that to you? What the fuck do you care if I have a kid? I don't think she said fuck, but you know what I'm saying. He never was the one who wanted her gone. He didn't even know about her. He didn't know who she was. It was the people in the factory who wanted her gone, who claimed that it came all the way from the top, right? So Valjean ends up saying to Javert, like, I don't think we should arrest her. And Javert is like, but she's a criminal and a prostitute, and that makes her an enemy of the Lord. And Valjean's like, shut up, dude. And anyway, Valjean ends up basically, like, exerting his mayoral power to force Javert to not arrest her and embarrasses him in front of all of his colleagues. And then he brings her to a hospital because she's very clearly sick at this point. And she's really happy. For the first time in, like, 50 pages, she feels like her life is turning around. It's also the end of book 5. On to book 6. Alright, we're nearing the end here, guys. Whew. Fantine? Really sick, okay? And Valjean keeps sending for Cosette, but the Thénardiers won't send her over because they view her as their, like, cash cow, right? So they keep saying that he needs to settle Fantine's debts and then he'll send them money. And then they're like, oh, no, she actually owed us more money than that. And he's like, what the hell is going on? And they just refuse to send Cosette. At some point during all of this, Javert shows up to Valjean's office and asks to be dismissed. And Valjean is like, why, dude? Like, what the heck? And he's like, well, I went and tried to turn you in for being fugitive Jean Valjean, who skipped his parole and stole from this kid a few years ago, and we've been looking for him ever since, and we haven't been able to find him. And he's like, I wrote to the constable or something, I forget what they call him, and I accused you of being that guy, but turns out that guy was recently arrested and is actually facing trial for a pretty simple theft, but he's sure to go to prison for life because he's a repeat offender and a fugitive, and that's Jean Valjean. There's a really interesting speech in here where Javert also says that he feels like he has to be treated the same that he's treated other people, right? That he firmly believes that once you've done a bad deed, you deserve to be arrested. And so he's like, I accused you with basically no proof. It was literally just me trying to go off of my recognition of you, and that's messed up. I shouldn't have done that, and I turned out to be wrong, and so I deserve to be punished. And, you know, ACAB, but also good on him for like recognizing that and like owning up to it. Like, I don't know, there's like a weird amount of responsibility here that I can actually respect out of Javert, right? And it shows that he doesn't think himself above his own rules. Like, this is what he believes about life, so he believes that he's subject to those rules too, and I can appreciate that as well. But Valjean's just like, you're a cool dude. And this book ends. It's a really short one. All right. Book 7. Fantine is clearly dying. Okay, she's still dying. Valjean is deliberating about what he should do, knowing that this man has been arrested for being him, right? This is also when Victor Hugo actually reveals that this guy is Valjean, but the way that he reveals him is by saying, the reader has undoubtedly guessed that M. Madeleine is none other than Jean Valjean, so it's expected that you've known this whole time that it was Valjean, right? Here's where I ask myself a really interesting question. Would I be enjoying this book more or less if I wasn't so familiar with the musical? And the answer is, I think there's some parts that I've enjoyed more and some parts that I've enjoyed less. Like, I don't know, like, overall it might be the same, but I think certain parts I might have liked better than I do now because of that. I'm obviously familiar with all the main characters and I already care about them, and every time one of them gets revealed, it's almost like a Marvel reveal, you know, when they're like, it's Captain Marvel, and then it like cuts to her and like zooms in on her face and she's just standing there like, yep, it's me, and the crowd in the movie theater is like, oh my god, it's Captain Marvel. Well, I'll be reading the book and it'll be like, and this woman named Fantine, and I'm like, oh my god, it's Fantine. And then obviously like Easter eggs, like I'm catching these little like foreshadowings and these little things that he's dropped in there because I'm familiar with the plot and I know where it's going. But we've stumbled here on a large swath of pages that I really think I'd have enjoyed a lot more if I didn't know where they were going. Here, we are given a solid 60 pages of Valjean deliberating on whether or not he should turn himself in and free this man. If he turns himself in, he frees this innocent man, but if he doesn't, he keeps his nice life, but he has to go the rest of his life knowing that another man is in prison in his place. There's a really great line from the musical that captures this perfectly that says, if I speak, I am condemned. If I stay silent, I am damned. And that's basically what he's struggling with, right? His happiness versus his conscience. He decides, you know what? I'm not going to decide right now. I'm going to go to the trial. I'm going to go watch his trial, and I'll decide while I'm there what I'm going to do. And then we get a lot of pages of him traveling, and basically the whole time he's just deliberating it. Every time he runs into an issue, he's like, maybe this is God telling me I shouldn't turn myself in, and then it'll end up working out, and he's like, oh dang it, like I need to turn myself in, or I don't know, and he's just going back and forth. He starts to try and convince himself too that because so many people in this whole like area like to rely on him for money, and it'd be really bad for them if he went to prison, that there's like an element of goodness in him staying out of prison. So finally, he arrives at the trial, and he's deliberating, and he's sitting there watching the whole thing, and he's deliberating more, and he's on the fence, what to do, and finally, he bursts into the middle of the trial, and he says, I'm Jean Valjean. I would have just played the clip from the musical where he actually sings that in like a very powerful voice, but I do eventually hope to be monetized on YouTube, and I would hate to get copyright strike then, you know what I mean? Okay, I desperately have to talk fast now because my phone just ran out of storage and I had to delete all the videos from the first video I made to be able to keep filming, so we're gonna have to wrap this up. Anyway, all of this is very exciting, terribly interesting, except I knew the whole time that he was going to end up turning himself in. So I'll admit, I just kind of skimmed this part and I don't really have a lot of like deeper thought about it, except that I kind of agree with his choice, right? I think he did the right thing by turning himself in. And everyone's so stunned by his confession because he's known as this like very good man and this famous mayor, that they let him just walk out of the trial because he literally, he admits that he's Valjean. He proves it by recognizing thing about the prisoners that are supposedly identifying the other guy. And then he's like, all right, deuces everyone. And they literally just let him walk out. And that's the end of the book. On to book 8. All right, this is the last one. We can do this. I can get this out before my phone runs out of storage. We open on Fantine on the brink of death. This is like the 3rd book in a row that we've opened on her, like, basically dying, right? Valjean shows up, but they low-key told Fantine that Valjean went to get Cosette because she was really stressed when she woke up and he wasn't there. And so she's expecting him to come back with Cosette and is confused as to why Cosette is not with him. They end up wondering if Cosette will save her because she seems in better health because she thinks that he's going to show up with Cosette. But dun dun dun, Javert arrives. Turns out that after everybody recovered from the shock of finding out that the mayor is a criminal, they actually did want him arrested, and so they sent Javert to go take care of that. Javert shows up at Fantine's bedside, and a combination of her fear of Javert arresting her again, the knowledge of who the mayor, like, really is, and then the fact that Cosette isn't there ends up being too much for her emotionally, and she succumbs to her illness. I don't like this. I don't like this difference, okay? In the musical, Fantine just dies before Javert gets there, right? She dies of her illness, and then Javert gets there and they have the whole confrontation. But I don't like this because I feel like they're kind of blaming Javert for Fantine's death. And in fact, Valjean literally does. He says to him, you have killed this woman. But I don't think that's fair. Like, if the whole point is that society were the ones to kill Fantine, why are we blaming Javert? Don't get me wrong, I'm not defending Javert. I don't think he's a good guy, but I also don't think he's, like, solely at fault for Fantine's death. So Valjean begs for time to save Cosette, but Javert is, of course, like, no, dude, I'm taking you to prison. What's wrong with you? And so he does, but Valjean escapes genuinely immediately. Like, within 5 minutes of getting to the city jail, he just escapes. It's kind of crazy. He's at his place and he's kind of trying to gather things to be able to run off. And one of the nuns comes and is like talking to him. And then Javert, they hear him coming up the stairs and they're like, oh no. And so Valjean hides in the corner and the nun pretends to pray. Javert sees this from outside the door and he's like, oh, so sorry, sister. Don't mean to disturb you. By the way, is Valjean in there, perchance? Now, this nun is known for not being much of a liar, and by that I mean she's known for never lying. It's a really big deal, okay? It's mentioned multiple times. This nun never lies, and everybody knows that. And so Javert asks her, is Valjean in the room? And she lies. For the first time in her entire life, she lies. She says he's not in there. And then Javert is like, are you sure? And she's like, I haven't seen him. So she lies twice, right in a row. Hugo has a whole passage here where he celebrates her, right? He says, may this lie be counted for you in paradise. And here's where the themes are kind of, they're oh, nails, ASMR. The overarching theme, the idea that you can do something bad in the name of good, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's bad. Like, that's what we're seeing here, because Javert, he thinks he's doing the right thing, and it even says at some point in this whole passage that it's like all the evil of good, right? That like it's like that road to hell is paved with good intentions idea. And at the same time, lying is theoretically wrong, and this nun lies, and yet we view this lie as a good deed, right? And so there's this really interesting balance of like, it's not as simple as like knowing a deed is good or bad, because how many people are there who justify their horrible actions, like in the name of doing something good, of doing something righteous, and are horrible to other people, claiming that they're doing the right thing. You know what I mean? And so on both sides of it, we're seeing like Javert is on paper doing the right thing, but it's not really a good deed, is it? And then this nun is on paper doing a bad thing, but it's kind of a good deed, isn't it? This book, and subsequently the entire Fantine section, ends with Fantine's body being thrown in a public burial ground, despite the fact that Valjean ends up actually leaving money behind for her burial. It's a public burial site that they use for people who were experiencing homelessness, right? And I almost hesitate to mention that because I don't want to give the US government any ideas. It was a really interesting end to the section. I think it just really puts that nail in the coffin of society was never good to Fantine, and they never were going to be good to her. And it's really sad. It's sad. Whew! 300 pages exactly. fifth of the way through the book. What have we learned? The first thing I want to highlight is something I've said a bunch, so I'll just overview it, and that's that there's really a timeless message here, right? I think it's so eerie sometimes how you can read books that were written so long ago and you feel like they apply so much to the society you live in. And it just, that idea that history repeats itself and that human beings are predictable, it's crazy. It's really, really crazy and very existential. It's inspiring to me, I'll be honest. As someone who's working on my own book, there is something so inspiring about reading a book that was written 150 years ago that feels like it was written yesterday. It's like if you can really get to the core of human nature, if you can really see things how they are, then you can write timeless works of fiction that will apply at any point. There's the prison reform, the hypocrisy amongst the righteous, the like gossip in the factory and them like trying to get her kicked out for no reason, all the stuff with the Thénardiers like bleeding her dry, like all of this is stuff that you could totally picture happening like now. It doesn't have to take place in 1815 for all of this to be true. The second thing I want to say is the writing is really, really beautiful. Like not only does the story feel like it could have happened yesterday, but the writing flows like it was written much more recently than it actually was. I find with classics, it's sometimes very hard to read and really get into the flow of reading because the sentence structure is often very different from what we're used to. But somehow this has a very modern voice and I'm finding it flows really well and I'm enjoying it. I find myself really sucked into the narrative at points. I don't want to spoil that much more. Like there's so much here, but I feel like it's going to end up having to come up in later videos because there's so much more plot to get through. Like we have like 1,200 more pages of plot to get through. For now, I'll just leave off by saying this is a gut-wrenching, like horrifically sad and yet stunningly beautiful work of fiction, and I'm understanding why it has stood the test of time. It's a work of art, in my opinion, at least so far. My understanding is that at some point very soon, I'm going to end up reading like multiple chapters about sewage though, so maybe I'll withhold my judgment on its artistic merit until the final video. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to offset this video with doing something fun because I could totally see myself kind of burning out on this and I really want to make all 5 videos. I want to do all 5 sections. I want to read the whole book. And so I honestly can't tell you if the next video I'm going to post is the next installment in the series or if I'll do something else in the meantime. So I guess you're just going to have to subscribe to find out. But never fear, I will make the other sections, so if that's what you want to see, then if you subscribe, you won't regret it. I want to end every video in this series by reading a 1-star review of Les Mis on Goodreads. So we have this lovely one today, which says, "A little too miserable for me." I hope you have a great day and presumably multiple weeks until I post again, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!